Hello and welcome to my channel. This is part, I think 7, 8 of the Jill Duggar book review. We are 2/3 of the way through. Yay! So we stopped off last week on a very serious note. So Jill's second baby, her second son, Samuel, the doctors were not sure if he had brain damage at birth because he was, she had a very difficult birth, very traumatic birth in which both she and her son almost died. So she talks about how her husband went to her brother's bachelor party, pretty tame party, and some of the cameramen were there for TLC, for the family show, for 19 Kids and Counting, or Counting On, I guess it was called at the time, or at that point. And they were asking her, how's everything going? How's your little guy doing? She was really close with the crew. So the crew was, obviously different than the producers, the snakes that were the producers. They decided, she and her husband decided they would keep things to themselves for now regarding their son's health issues. She says, we were going to protect him. I was going to give Samuel what I didn't have myself when I was younger. Definitely. I mean, she talks about her parents putting the kids all over TV, obviously everything that came out with her brother, and then she does talk about how she was put under for a dental surgery, and how loopy she was, and she was saying things on camera that she was embarrassed about later, and everything, and that she should have been protected. And then of course, during her brother's actual trial, her dad did not protect them at all. He lied and said he couldn't remember anything his son had done. So she and her husband took the baby to the doctor to get scanned when he was several months old. They said, usually we see some scarring after a bleed like that, but there's nothing, everything is healed. That doesn't mean he won't have any lasting issues. We're still going to want to evaluate him every 3 months until he's around 2 years old. But if he's walking and talking and doing all the things we'd expect him to be doing by then, we won't need to see him anymore. She says it was like we'd been released from death row. So she talks about how she was wanting to move on kind of from her upbringing and a little bit from her family, just to give some space. But she says for every whisper of hope, there was an avalanche of guilt. For every moment of joy, there was a stab of fear. I had to thank IBLP to thank for that particular baggage. Ever since I was a kid, every decision I'd made had been gripped with a level of guilt or fear that weighed heavy in my decision making. So yeah, that was pretty common from what I saw, with kids who were raised very sheltered by parents who were very controlling. There was definitely control by fear, which is how cults run. It's a recipe for abuse. If you think about, for example, the polygamous sect of Mormons in Utah, the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints in Short Creek on the Utah-Arizona border. So a lot of the survivors talk about how they didn't want to leave because they had been raised to believe if they ever left that they would be condemned to hell. If you grow up believing this, I mean, why would you want to leave? I mean, it's totally brainwashing. It's complete brainwashing. I did see some kids, and these were the more extreme cases. Dare I say, some homeschool kids were like this. I mean, because if you get your kid into private school, even a private Christian school or public school, they're going to learn that some of these things aren't the truth, like the fear-based stuff. There's some crazy beliefs out there. Oh, if you believe this, your family's gonna be cursed, or if you do this, your whole family will be cursed. I mean, that is just wild. But some people do believe that, and so that's how they control people in their family or their spouses. So Jill says that at first the guilt manifested itself around children, specifically whether I would be physically able to have any more. So she heavily damaged her uterus. It ruptured during her last birth, and so she had to go on birth control, which she never thought she would do, in order to save herself from getting pregnant, which would be life-threatening. She said, as my body started to heal, my mind became troubled. She said, I was just waking up to the possibility that I might not be able to have any more kids. It was not an easy thing for me to accept. So she talks about after Mr. Gothard, Bill Gothard, who was the head of IBLP, stepped down, was basically kicked out in 2014 after dozens of women came forward accusing him of abuse. She'd really started questioning the IBLP view of scripture. She says, the closer I looked at the Bible, the more it seemed to contradict what I had been taught as a child, especially the idea that adult children were still under their parents' authority, and the way they had placed Mr. Gothard on a pedestal. So that's why a lot of people say that IBLP is a cult, because Gothard did twist scripture, so it was like completely deceptive. It was not what was in the Bible. But a lot of people didn't realize that unless they knew the Bible really well. He also did weird stuff like make people wear navy blue, and he wanted women to have long curly hair. I will link a Homeschoolers Anonymous video or article down below, blog post I guess, just pointing out everything Gothard did that was like very cult-like. Like some different churches too. I mean, you could start a cult anywhere. There are some small churches that have become really wild and just branched off in that direction because you have a pastor who's in a position of authority and he gets power hungry. One thing leads to another over the years. But control is a big thing, especially with sheltered children. So I knew this family. They only had 2 kids. The parents were in full control of them, even as adults. They eventually branched off and went to a church that had split from our church. That was, you know, only homeschooled families were allowed to join this church. It's called Sky Valley Bible Church. I don't know if it's still that way now. I can't speak for them, but they split off from our church in 1995. Anyway, the parents of the children. Of course, they did not allow their kids to associate with any other kids other than ones they selected. I mean, even other homeschooled kids, they were like, you know, they had to be very selective. There's this other kid in our church who reached out to one of the sons, and they were all in their early 20s at this point. Reached out to the son because he used to play with him, he used to be friends with him, and he hadn't heard from him in a while. The kids did not work outside of the home, or did not work for any outsiders. They had to work for the parents, and it was just definitely like could have led to an abusive situation. I don't know if it was. He called the house, and the mother answered, and it was like 8:30 at night, and she was like, "Oh, I don't know why you're calling so late." And I was like, "It's 8:30." She would not allow him to speak to her son, who was like maybe 24 at this point. I don't know, 22 to 24 years old. The other kid pressed, and he said, "I really need to speak to," I forget what the kid's name was, but "I really need to speak to John. And I really want to know that he's okay. I haven't heard from him in a long time." She put her son on the phone. The other kid said he could tell that the son, John, was being told what to say. The son said, "I don't want to be friends with someone who disrespects my mother," and then told him to not call again or come to their property, which he hadn't done. Anyway, then he hung up the phone. And the kid who was friends with John told me that these were the type of people where if you wanted to go to their house, even to drop something off, you needed to schedule it a week in advance. Like, these people were very, very paranoid. Okay, back to the book. Jill talks about going to visit a family friend who just had a baby, and she said her parents were there. And then she and another friend were talking in the hallway, and her parents were out there. Friend whispered, "How are you doing? Are you healing up?" And she said, "I was careful about Samuel, careful keeping the story about his birth to only the closest people." Alright, my battery died on my camera because, yeah, apparently I didn't charge the camera properly. So I charged it for like 10 minutes. I just have one more thing to say, or one more thing to go over. So Jill responds to her friend and says, "It was rough. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to have any more kids. My friend reached out to put an arm around me, but before she could say anything, Pop's voice filled the corridor." We don't know for sure, do we? Who is we? I mean, you're not the one having these children. I'm sure he just sees his grandchildren as moneymakers, so. Jill says, "I wanted to ask him why he thought he had the right to comment about my uterus, but I bit the words back." Boom, boom. Good for you, Jill. Good for you. She said, "It was triggering. It hit a nerve in me, invalidated my feelings, and pressed on the bruise of my guilt. Even though contraceptives were generally not allowed in IBLP, I'd used birth control after having the C-section with Samuel, knowing that all medical advice recommended not getting pregnant for about 18 months after the operation." She said, "Derek and I prayed about it. They agreed as a couple it wasn't wrong for them to use non-abortive contraception, and we knew we were making healthy choices, but that didn't lessen the guilt that I felt, and it went against the way I was raised." Okay, a couple things here. What she means by non-abortive contraceptive is some people, especially evangelicals, some Catholics too, some Mormons, and just people in general who don't, they believe that some certain forms of birth control are abortive. Like, I think some people believe the IUD is abortive, and it all has to do with like when the sperm fertilizes the egg and everything like that. But you know, that's a decision for every person to make by themselves. So it sounds like they use condoms, because she has said in interviews that they use non-hormonal contraceptives. So yeah, I mean, going against the way you're raised with like birth control, yeah, I mean, that's huge, and it will cause guilt. I mean, everything that's been ingrained in you as a child, being raised in the church, I mean, I can only speak for myself with certain things. Like, there's certain things that I will not do, and cannot do, even though I've done a lot of things. It's been ingrained into me since I was a small child. So I'm like, I would feel horrendous guilt if I did these things. So I think you can only feel that way if you've been raised in a faith. So she talks about there was a chance that perhaps my body simply wouldn't be able to sustain another pregnancy, and that I would never be able to give birth again. It was earth-shattering, and the prospect left me traumatized. Yeah, I mean, these girls are raised to believe that they should have large families, and if they can't, they're sometimes perceived to be lesser than the community. I will say there were a handful of people in my Baptist church who believed, and this was not the majority, but just some people, who believed that the more children you had, the like higher your status was. And I remember our youth pastor, the one that eventually went to prison. I've made a few shorts about him if you want to check that out on my channel, but I will be making a full video, or maybe a few videos on him. But he and his like 19-year-old wife only had like 2 kids at the time, and the youth pastor was doing a sermon in church and said, I feel sorry for people who only have 1 child. Actually, he may have had 3 at that point. And he said something like, maybe it wasn't 1 child. He said maybe it wasn't that he felt bad for people who only had 1 child. Maybe it was 2. I don't know. And like a bunch of people in the church had like 1 or 2 kids, including my parents who only have 2 kids. And people were like, excuse me? And I have known of people, or known of a friend who would only feel fulfilled if they had a large family. And then when they can't, because of fertility issues or just different health issues, they just feel very depressed and everything. I will say this is the reason why so many people, so many families in the church, and not just the evangelical church, Mormons and even Muslims and families like that, will go into poverty by having so many children, because they believe in their heart that, and they've been raised since birth to believe that having a big family will bring you more blessings, and that it's what you need to do, and that by using birth control you're going against God. So that's the mentality. Anyway, my battery's about to die again. I need to recharge it. So thanks for watching. Check back next week and we will get through this book together. It's a really good book. Highly recommend it. I will link it down below. I do receive a small commission if you use the link to purchase this book. Anyway, until next week.